Good morning. Today we're going to talk some developmental psychology. So I'm going to break this topic into five different chunks, five different, manageable little chunks. First, we'll talk about some kind of an overview of development and the processes of the whole thing. But we're going to focus our discussion not, on events themselves, but on stage theories, okay? Because the stage theories are a dominant thing in the field of psychology. So after we do a little overview, we'll talk about cognitive development with Piaget, and then we'll talk some social development with Eric Erikson, a little slice of moral development with Lawrence Kohlberg, and then we'll kind of talk about adolescence and adulthood, kind of lump them together at the end. Okay? So developmental psychology is an interesting field. It's a study of the physical, cognitive, and social changes across the lifespan. What's interesting I remember the first time I went to teach developmental psychology. It was focusing on child. It was a child psychology course, and it was very interesting because the textbooks, there's two different kinds. There's one that tries to go chronologically. That is, it tries to do what happens at age 1, age 2, age 3, age 4, something like this. And another versions or others that try to do stages, or not stages, what am I trying to say? Different types of development. So we talk about cognitive development, physical development, social development, and talk about them separately. And the problem is neither one of these approaches is actually all that good. They're both kind of a bad approach. Because the problem is that as children get old, there are these distinctly different types of development, cognitive, social, physical, etc. But yet at the same time, they're so intimately tied, so you kind of sort of have to talk about them separately, but yet you can't talk about them separately. Like later on, we're going to talk about moral development, and we'll be talking about stages of moral development, and we're like, well, unless a child has passed this stage of cognitive development, this stage of morality doesn't even make sense. Or even social development, until a child learns to understand another's point of view and perspective, how can they possibly making moral judgments that are inclusive of other people and stuff? So it's really strange to talk about them as though they're separate, but yet I don't know that there's any better way to do it. Okay, so some of the big issues in developmental psychology, clearly nature versus nurture. And I mean, come on, this is an old question. How much of our heredity is influenced by nature? How much is influenced by experience or nurture? A huge question, obviously. I mean, what can I say? Continuity versus stages. And again, it was really Piaget that came up with this notion of stages. Because before Piaget, the idea was that children are just miniature adults or something like that. I was like, no, that's not really true. And so what Piaget basically said is children's thinking is just distinctly different. It's not just less than or something like that. It's just of a different category. So he's the first one that put together this notion of stages, and it's become popular ever since. The next thing is stability versus change, and this is like, are we the same person across our entire lifespan, or do we in fact change as we age? And this is an interesting thing, and it's always like you always hear ladies with bad choices in men that say things like, I can change him. And it's like, I'm sorry, from what I've seen, you can't. Okay? Stability generally is a relatively true thing, especially when it comes to personality. The person you are today is fairly well the person you will be for the rest of your life. There's only one event that has really been shown to really shake up personality, and that is actually the act of going to the university. All right, it's an amazing thing. Before the university, your personality profile will be radically different than after the university, but after that, you're pretty much going to be a stable person. So, interesting. Stability. Change. Wait, what is that? Oh, here. So, just to sort of give us a thought, because we're going to be talking about some of these stage theories and stuff, but when a newborn is born, they have a temperament, okay? They have it's kind of like if we were talking nature versus nurture and we were talking the question of personality, then temperament would almost be like the nature side of personality, or what does personality form from, or what is the first elements. And so infants are born, and some are jumpy, some are born anxious, almost like every little sound makes them jump. Some are content, right? They sleep peacefully. Some are needy and clingy. I mean, right from birth, these elements of personality have emerged. Infants are born with reflexes. Reflexes are, I mean, how do I put it? The building blocks of learning. Okay, so someday we'll talk about learning, I'm sure, but the building blocks of learning are reflexes. Later on, we're going to have unconditioned reflexes, right? Some Pavlovian. Unconditioned reflexes are those things that an infant is born with. So one of the inborn reflexes that infants have is the rooting reflex, right? That if you touch the cheek or even brush the cheek, then turn your head, search for the nipple. Infants are born with the ability to habituate. Habituation, and in fact, this is even before birth, by the way. Habituation occurs even in the womb. That decreasing responsiveness. So if the exact same stimulus is presented over and over and over, what happens is that eventually they habituate, infants stop responding to it, And so what we find is that researchers, when they want to know what infants are capable of, what they'll do is use habituation, because of course they can't use language, right? Let's say they wanted to find out if an infant could tell the difference between blue and green, for example. Okay? And so, if they wanted to find out if you could tell the difference between blue and green, they just ask you, can you tell the difference? You say, yes, because you have a form of behavior that infants don't have, right? Language. So what they'll do with an infant is they'll present it with blue, and the blue square or something, and the infant will be like, oh, cool, blue, wow, right? And eventually the kid will put it away, bring it back out, and the kid says, oh, wow, cool. Right? You do this 10, 20 times, and eventually you bring out the blue square, and the kid's like, yeah, whatever, been there, done that, seen that, I'm not interested, okay? So once the child has, in fact, habituated to the blue square, then you bring out the green square. And if the kids go, wow, that's cool, you're like, you know what? This kid can tell the difference between blue and green. But if you pull the green square out and the kid's just still is like, been there, done that, seen it, not interested, you're like, okay, this kid cannot tell the difference between blue and green. So habituation is an interesting tool for trying to assess what infants are capable of. Yeah, interesting. Characteristics which are necessary to understand a stage theory. These stages in stage theories occur in a specific sequence. They don't change, and they're universal stages. Okay, they're universal. They're predictable. And what's going to happen is that there's going to be these critical periods for development. And if you don't have the necessary input at the right point, then it's just gone. It's going to be too late. So, these stage theories seem to correspond to brain development, right? That is, the brain is ready at certain points to receive certain information. We find here, for example, here's a number of cortical neurons, all right? And you see at birth, and then at 3 months, and at 15 months. And what's actually pretty interesting is actually the number of cortical neurons will actually drop off quite a bit as this infant develops. What happens is the infant gets all of these neurons in their brain, which is all potential, wow, and then it's just massive interconnections. And then what happens is those connections that are repeatedly seen, like when I see salt, I see pepper next to it. Aha! Thoughts of salt lead to thoughts of pepper. And so the neural connections between salt and pepper will get very, very, very strong. But perhaps, salt and dog, and it's like I've never seen salt and dog together, and so the connection between salt and dog doesn't get used and dies away. So the connections that get a lot of input get stronger. Connections that don't get any input disappear. And so, in fact, this 15-month is a pretty big, pretty tight image. You get older, and then in fact the neural network gets much smaller but much more efficient. Okay, so it gets much better. So maturation is a funky term, a biological growth process, or blah, 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 generally not that much influenced by experience. Like, say, for example, all over the world, infants learn to walk at almost exactly the same age. It doesn't matter if they're like free range babies or, free range, like they let the kids just roam around or crawl or whatever. And in some cultures, infants are basically strapped to mom's back all day long and never get a chance to move. Then it doesn't matter. They learn to walk at almost exactly the same age. The brain, yeah, oh, look at me. I just kind of sort of said this, but that's okay. Experience develops the neural connections, like we said. It's use it or lose it kind of a thing. Those connections that aren't used tend to fizzle away. Okay? It occurs throughout the entire lifetime. There's a funky word called plasticity. The brain is plastic, which is to say it changes. It changes in response to input it receives. And it is most plastic at the earliest ages. It becomes, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, right? Well, no, that's not true. You can teach an old dog new tricks, but it becomes a heck of a lot harder. Okay, so we find another burst in connections around age 50, but whatever. We find underneath my face here, touch causes a baby human or animal to gain weight and to develop more, faster. Even infant rats, if you just pet them and hold them a little bit, they get larger, they get smarter, believe it or not. All right, so we'll stop on that, and we will come and do cognitive development in a little bit.